Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode. I hope everybody had a lovely Easter. And tonight I wanted to talk about different teaching strategies that you can use while teaching social studies, especially when you're looking at teaching history. And not only am I going to talk about these strategies that you should use, but I'm also going to touch on these strategies that you should probably avoid in your classroom. And maybe some strategies that might get you in a little bit of hot water. So if this is your first time catching us live, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Patty. I am a 4-5 split grade teacher in Ontario, Canada, and I come live every single Monday night to talk about teaching with inquiry and all of the different strategies that teachers today need to use in their classroom and how to implement this in a way that makes teaching engaging and fun for both teachers and their students. So let's dig right in. What kind of teaching strategies do you need to teach in your social studies classroom? So we're going to go through a few of these right now. Now, the first one that I like to talk about is a graffiti write. I think using a graffiti write in your classroom is a great way to get all of your students in your class on task and writing what they think. It takes some of the pressure off about writing neatly or writing in all one direction. It really gives students an opportunity to circle that chart paper and surround it and then just get their ideas down. And it looks pretty neat when you hang it up on the wall too afterwards. So on the slide here, I have a picture of what I've used for both science, actually, because it's the photo that I could find, as well as social studies, where I just simply pose questions or a topic, and that goes in the center of my chart paper. And then around the outside, either I'm doing the recording as my students are talking, or my students themselves are actually writing their ideas in answers to their questions. Some of the questions I would put down there are: what do you know? What do you wonder? What do you see? Especially if we're looking at some photographs. And when I'm just talking about a topic, I might put the topic of government in the center of a chart paper and simply just ask students, what do they know? What do they wonder? And what kind of background knowledge that they might have. And I will record while they talk and share. And I will write in different colors all over the board, all over the chart paper, so that we can maybe later take those and circle them and connect them and really draw some conclusions based on some of the things that we have seen. One of my absolute favorite ways to share student thinking, and I find it's really an important way to look at social studies, and I use this strategy for every single time, and it's one of the anchors of many of my inquiry-based units, is using a wonder wall. Now, when I do this, I really focus on student questions, and they get the pictures, and we come up with questions, and we talk about it, and we activate knowledge. It really allows me to see what students are interested in and what they're doing. So I will often either give them actual regalia and real life objects that they can inquire about, or I will simply replace that regalia, if I don't have it, with a photograph. And I let those photos circulate amongst my students and we ask questions. Sometimes photos might not work and it might just be words that I will put out and have students share their questions about that topic, such as, say, government. What might their questions be about government? What do they want to know more about? And then from there, I will group those questions into themes. Generally speaking, I will choose my photos and regalia very intentionally so that I know that it's going to prompt and get students to focus on some questions over the others. And I make sure that that is tied to the specific curriculum expectations for my curriculum. So I want to make sure sure that students are using questions, and when I group them together, I will take those grouped questions and they will turn into learning goals and success criteria, and then I post that up on the wall. That's what we reference as we're going through our learning, because that is our goal, is to be looking at finding answers to those questions. Another thing I think is really important is to help support that wonder wall is to use photos and regalia whenever possible to really make learning real for your students by taking photos. You can find those photos on lots of different photo sites, including just simply a Google image search, and having those photos available to your students so that they can see objects in real life, I think is really important. However, this is one of my warnings, I think, that we need to be very careful with as teachers, is especially when we're teaching history. Clip art is really cute. However, clip art is not appropriate for most cases when we're talking about early societies or early cultures or groups of people. We don't want to represent those groups of people with clip art. Now, one of the rules that I like to generally follow is, if that society still has living ancestors that still live in the same traditional way of life, such as First Nations peoples or Mayan civilization, even some Indian civilizations, still have ancestors and still have those cultural practices that are still very much alive and important to those people who currently live today. For those groups, I think it's really important that we respect to not use clip art to represent their cultural celebrations or their clothing or their dress. I think that's a really important distinction to make. If you have clip art of, say, buildings or modes of transportation, or even perhaps some pieces of food, as long as they're not ceremonial, then I think you're probably on a gray line there. But I think we really need to avoid using clip art whenever possible for those societies. Where I do think it may be a bit more acceptable is when you're talking about things such as medieval times, where you may be able to use clip art in that circumstance, because that is a time period that has since passed. So people are not still living in a medieval lifestyle currently today. They've moved past that. So Europeans don't still have armor and jousting. It's not part of their cultural celebrations and traditions. So in that case, you may be okay with using clip art. But I definitely think when we're talking about First Nations people or even Mayans civilizations, where you still have people that are alive today and still following that traditions and cultures, that I think we really need to avoid clip art under those circumstances. And that means also avoiding resources that are using clip art for that purpose as well. Another strategy I think is really important when using inquiry and teaching in social studies is using a debate or a thought tunnel. Now, this is one activity where you might be familiar with the concept of a debate. How I like to look at it through a thought tunnel is you have multiple people speaking at the same time. So if you have a debate, you might have one or two speakers at a time, and that might be great, especially if you have a class that definitely needs one or two people speaking at a time. But I think it's really important for social studies that we also recognize that we want students to be talking and keep that accountable talk up and keep as many students engaged as possible. So with a thought tunnel, you're going to have students facing one another in a line, and you're going to have them discussing across the aisle with the people across from them about a different topic. Now, you might want to have two opposing viewpoints on either side of the tunnel. This one would work great for teaching things like government and civics, because it allows students to take a position and a debate on different issues, especially if you're looking at things like around election time, or perhaps issues that relate to things like in the UN or other topics that come up when we're talking about government and civic. A jigsaw is complicated, I won't lie, a jigsaw is a complicated thing to organize for yourself as a teacher, and it does require that your students are responsible for doing their own share of the work. However, a jigsaw activity is the fastest way I have found to get the most information into the hands of my students. So if there is something that requires a lot of information or a lot of research and background knowledge, a jigsaw is, once you get it set up, it's the easiest way to get a lot of information in a short amount of time. So a jigsaw starts with two components. Number one, you have a home group, and each student is a part of a home group. So if you currently have your classroom set up in table groups, this is a great way to look at your home group as being your table group. Now, within your home group, you number off students. So if you have 6 people in your home group, you're going to number off your students 1 through 6. Those students, all of the ones from each of your table group are going to get together, and they're going to look at one aspect of learning. Then your number 2s are going to get together, and they're going to look at a different aspect of learning. Number 3s and number 4s, they all get together. Those form expert groups. So let's say you're covering early societies and you want your students to learn as much about different early societies, and you don't have a ton of time for them all to go to each station. A great way to do this is to have home groups, number off those people in the home groups, and then number 1, say, looks at ancient Egypt, expert group number 2 will look at ancient Rome, and so on and so forth. Once the expert groups have worked together to find information, you then go ahead and look at sharing back to your home group. So all of those ones break back and return to their table groups, and then they share what they've learned with the people at their table group. So they become the expert on that topic, and they share with the other people at the table group. So it's a really great way to be able to share that information. Another activity is a game. Now, I think a game is a really fun way for review, especially if you've got a lot of content. If you have students working together to learn a lot of information, it's a lot of fact-based or multiple choice type information. Government is a great one for that. A lot of civics, parts of social studies, history will have aspects where you can gamify that learning and review that material in a game type situation. However, one of the things I think we need to remember is with games, we need to know that games are fun. So the topics that we're covering can't be things in our history that were negative, horrific experiences for people. So it is absolutely not appropriate to make a game out of slavery. It's not okay to make a game out of World War II and Holocaust. It's not okay to make a game out of residential schools and residential school survivors. And that can even extend to looking at debating the two different sides of residential schools in your classroom. We have to be really careful when talking about these historical atrocities that have happened in our history and how we teach about that content to students. And it's not okay to turn these horrific experiences in our history to turn them into games to make learning about them more fun. When we're talking about historical atrocities, we shouldn't ever pick strategies in our classroom that allow students to learn about these in a fun game type way, because these were not games and it's not something that we can gamify. And I know that there's been a lot of teachers lately in the news, especially in the States, that have been getting in a little bit of hot or a lot of hot water about choosing activities such as Monopoly games to learn about slavery and the Underground Railroad, and using different activities with residential school survivors. So we need to be very careful about how we gamify learning, and that there is times where it can be appropriate in social studies, but there's also times when we're dealing with history and social studies where it's completely inappropriate to gamify that content. The next activity that I really like in social studies is a fishbowl activity. And this is if you have a class that has a difficult time having one large group knowledge building circle. So if you're finding that you can't get your students to take their turns while talking, then a fishbowl activity is a great way to teach them how to have a conversation without having, say, 25 people all trying to have a conversation together and battling who gets to talk. In a fishbowl, you select, say, 4 or 5 students and they sit in the center of a circle, and the remainder of your class sits around the outside. The people on the outside are listening to the conversation on the inside. You as the teacher will go around to the people on the perimeter, the listeners, and you will tap them in. You will invite them into the conversation. They will enter into that conversation and tap somebody who's in the conversation, who's been in there for a while. They will tap them out. So that person will leave and return to the perimeter while the new person jumps into the middle and continues the discussion. In this type of activity, everybody gets a say. The conversation is a little bit easier to manage for students because you're only really having a discussion with 5 people while others are watching. So for students, I think it's a little bit easier for them to understand conversational norms when there's only 5 people as opposed to 25 people. Also, if you have a lot of students that struggle with talking out and or dominating a conversation, this is a great way to allow some of those quieter students to speak up, because while they're in the center, they're the ones talking, and the others on the outside need to listen because they're supposed to be jumping into the conversation and being able to jump in and continue as necessary. I recently tried this one in my classroom, and I was absolutely amazed at how well my students did, and the discussion as it just continued to go and get deeper and deeper as students really got into discussing the topic that we were learning about and evaluating. And I will definitely be using this one more often. Sometimes I think all of us, we forget, we have these strategies, we know we learned about them, but we forget about them. So I think it's important that we get these reminders and keep going. Role play is another activity that is often fun and engaging for students, especially in social studies. And you've got lots of different ways that you can role play with students. I think role play follows that same rules as, say, clip art, that you definitely want to look at who is okay to role play and who is not okay to engage in a role play with. We definitely do not want to be role playing and taking on roles as First Nations people, especially if we're including costumes in that. We don't want to appropriate culture, and I think it's really important that we recognize that that's a possibility. I think, however, with some societies that no longer are in existence, role play becomes a little bit easier. So if you're looking at ancient Rome or medieval times, again, those may be more appropriate to include in a role play. You can also include role play into civics lessons where you have students doing, say, a mock parliament where they are modeling what that would look like. And again, I think the warning here is the idea of dressing up and making, say, headdresses as part of art and wearing them and recreating something that we know now to not be the most accurate as that first meal at Thanksgiving between our indigenous peoples and European explorers, that is perhaps a very whitewashed version of the Thanksgiving story. So I think we need to be far more accurate in how we represent events that have happened in history, and not to appropriate that by making light of some of the atrocities that have happened. So is making an Indian headdress in school okay for Thanksgiving? It's absolutely not. Now, these are obviously American news, except for City News. This is a report for someone from North Carolina. But things like a slave-themed game, again, not okay. So I think we have to be really careful with how we choose to pick different resources in our classroom. I also think that a popular activity, because it's wonderful, is the blanket activity for teaching our students about First Nations. However, we have to be really careful with this and understand that the blanket activity should only be administered by people who are allowed to administer it. It's not just for any teacher to be able to do the blanket activity in their classroom. The blanket activity, which is a First Nations story needs to be done by somebody who is allowed to do it. I'm not sure if it's a certification or if it's some training that has gone to, but there is only certain people. And I think if you're looking for somebody, it's a good place to ask your First Nations Inuit Métis consultant at the school or through your school board to see if there is somebody available that can come and run that activity with your students. But unless you are trained in this activity, it's really important that you not take that on and do it yourself in your classroom. Field trips. Field trips are a fantastic way if you have the ability to plan them without doing 37 pieces of paperwork in order to get them done. Field trips are a lovely and wonderful way to bring social studies alive for your students and teach them about different places so that they can go and experience the history in lots of different ways. A placemat activity is another one that I really love doing. It's very similar to a graffiti write, except it's a little bit more organized because students have a very specific place that they are to write on their page. And this is a great way where you're asking a question, each student writes their answers, then they compare their answers and kind of come up with some conclusions, and that conclusion goes in that pool section that you see there. I think it's a really great way to hold students accountable for writing, and you can get a little bit more assessment in this activity than you can in a graffiti write because you don't know who wrote what. But in a placemat activity, it's a bit more organized and you actually have the ability to look at what each specific student is saying. Maps are absolutely necessary to teach about social studies and geography. I think it's imperative that we are using maps and relating the information that we're teaching back to their actual locations so that students know that these are real. Using topographic maps to be able to look at the environment, how the environment impacted different peoples, I think is really important, as well as looking at that link between environmental science as well as history and geography. Timelines and mapping are another way that we can help students in science and social studies. There's a lot of information that students need to cover in history, especially in our curriculum. So I think it's really important to get students to map that out and timeline different events. Whether you're timelining, say, a election or you are timelining the early societies, I think using a timeline is another great way to be able to teach science or social studies. And finally, using a carousel or gallery walk. When you have questions, a gallery walk and a carousel is when you have questions posted all around your room or perhaps pictures all around your room and students wander and meander around your classroom, going to those different sections and talking about what it is they see there. They're talking with each other about what they see on there, and then they are writing their answer to the question. So it's a conversation. It's a bit different from a placemat or a graffiti because they're just writing before they have the conversation. With a carousel or gallery walk, in social studies in particular, you want students to move around from different sections in groups, and you want them to discuss what they see on the chart paper as a group before they write it. So there needs to be some discussion there, and then they're going to write it. And if you have groups writing in different colors, then you can tell which group wrote what and really then bring it back into a whole group discussion at the end. Thank you. I'm hoping that those different teaching strategies were informative and helpful and also got you thinking about what we can and what we should be careful about using in social studies and history, that it's not just fair game, and we really have to be sensitive and aware of how to appropriately approach issues of history to make sure that we're presenting them in a fair and unbiased way, and that we are respecting truth and reconciliation, as that is becoming a more important part of our curriculum. We really need to be focused on that and using a variety of teaching strategies that I think work really, really well when looking at social studies and teaching both civics and geography and history in that context. So thank you so much for joining me tonight. I hope it was informative. If you want more information about these teaching strategies, I will be putting this presentation, the slides up here. They will be available on my website, on my blog at www.madlylearning.com, and those will be available when the blog post that goes with tonight's video will be posted later this week, so you can get those there. There's also lots of information in terms of different strategies you can use with inquiry-based teaching in my Inquiry 101 course, which when you're heading over to read that blog post from tonight's video, you can sign up for the Inquiry 101 course right there on my homepage. And there's lots more teaching strategies that are there and appropriate, and some handouts and different resources for you to be able to use when implementing inquiry-based learning. So thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you next week, Monday night at 9, where we are digging into teaching inquiry and talking all month, the month of May, all month long about planning. Because if you're like me, you're getting your teaching assignments for next year, and many of you are already starting to think ahead. So let's dig in and talk about planning all month long. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.